June 4, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. The Pacific sun hangs brutal and white over the cobalt waters northwest of Midway Atoll. Aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the air smells of aviation fuel, hot metal, and salt spray. Below decks, ordnance crews work in precise choreography, removing torpedoes from Type 97 carrier attack planes and replacing them with land attack bombs. The hangar deck echoes with the clang of wrenches and the shouts of petty officers. On the flight deck above, Zero fighters sit fueled and armed, their propellers still. The carrier cuts through the Pacific at 24 knots, her bow throwing white foam into the wind. No one aboard suspects that in exactly 4 minutes, the sky will crack open and their world will end in fire. Yet the men moving bombs and aviation ordnance across Akagi's hangar deck are the finest naval technicians in the Imperial Japanese Navy. They have trained for years in the doctrine of decisive battle, in the art of the carrier strike, in the belief that Japanese naval aviation is unmatched in the world. They believe this because, until this moment, it has been true. 6 months earlier, these same carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, launched the aircraft that devastated Pearl Harbor. In the month since, they have swept across the Pacific like a typhoon, sinking British battleships off Malaya, reducing Darwin to rubble, driving the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean. They have never been stopped. They have rarely even been challenged. The doctrine that guides them is called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. And it is a doctrine born from decades of study, war games, and the belief that a single, perfectly executed naval engagement can determine the fate of nations. And at its heart is the aircraft carrier, the weapon that has made Japan master of the Pacific. But doctrine is a fragile thing. It is built on assumptions, on what commanders believe to be true about their enemy and themselves. And in the mind of every Japanese admiral from Yamamoto down to the most junior staff officer, there exists a calculation about American capability. They know the Americans have carriers. They know the Americans have dive bombers, the Douglas SBD Dauntless, a plane the Japanese call slow but steady. They know in theory that dive bombers can strike moving targets. But theory and reality are separated by a gulf of experience. And the Japanese have never faced a massed dive bomber attack executed with the precision, timing, and lethality that is about to fall upon them. They do not know, cannot know, that American naval aviators have refined dive bombing into something approaching an art form. They do not know that those pilots trained to put a 1,000-pound bomb into a circle 250 feet wide from an altitude of 10,000 feet while the target steams at full speed. They do not know that the doctrine they dismiss as cautious and unimaginative has produced a weapon system capable of destroying a fleet carrier in less than 5 minutes. In the ready rooms of the carrier's Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, hours earlier, American pilots sat hunched over plotting boards, listening to final briefings. And these men are younger than their Japanese counterparts, less experienced in combat, but they have been drilled relentlessly in one thing: the approach angle, the dive speed, the exact moment to release ordnance on a moving target. The SBD Dauntless is not fast. It maxes out at about 250 miles per hour in level flight, slower than almost any fighter in the Pacific. But in a dive, with split flaps extended and the pilot pushing the nose down at 70 degrees, the Dauntless becomes something else. It becomes a guided projectile, a marriage of man, machine, and mathematics. The pilot does not aim like a fighter pilot, spraying bullets in a cone of probability. He aims like an artilleryman, calculating speed, wind, and the movement of the target, adjusting in real time as the altimeter spins backward and the ocean rushes up. At 2,000 feet, he releases. The bomb drops free, following a parabolic arc that has been calculated to intersect with a point in space and time where a carrier deck will be in exactly 3 seconds. It is geometry turned into violence. The Japanese admirals have seen dive bombers before. At Coral Sea, a month earlier, American aircraft damaged the carrier Shokaku badly enough to take her out of the war for months. But Coral Sea was a confused, sprawling battle fought in bad weather with limited visibility. Mistakes were made on both sides. The Japanese concluded that American dive bombers were competent but not exceptional, capable of hitting a stationary or slow-moving target under ideal conditions, but not a true threat to a carrier maneuvering at high speed. This assessment is repeated in staff meetings, unencoded in operational orders, and becomes accepted fact. It is the kind of fact that kills. At 10:22 a.m., three things happen almost simultaneously. The last of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol Zeros chasing American torpedo bombers descends to wave-top level, drawn down by the low, slow, suicidally brave attacks of Torpedo Squadron 8 and others who fly obsolete TBD devastators into walls of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese carriers, having evaded torpedo after torpedo through hard turns and speed, straighten out momentarily to prepare for their own launch. The strike that will finish off the American carriers their scouts have finally located. And 35 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, outreach their pushover points at 14,000 feet directly above the Kido Butai, undetected and unopened. There is no warning. Japanese lookouts, eyes strained from hours scanning for low-flying torpedo planes, do not think to look up. The Combat Air Patrol is out of position, fuel low, caught at sea level. Radar, which might have given minutes of warning, is a technology the Japanese have not prioritized. The carriers steam in a loose box formation, Akagi and Kaga to the north, Soryu and Hiryu to the south, their decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed, their hangar bays stacked with ordnance. They are not buttoned up for action. They are preparing to strike, not to be struck. Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, sees the white wakes first. 4 parallel lines scratched across the blue. He does not hesitate. Yet he pushes his stick forward, and the nose of his Dauntless drops like a stone. Behind him, 34 more aircraft follow, stacking into a nearly vertical dive, their perforated split flaps screaming as they deploy, a sound like the sky tearing itself apart. From the deck of Akagi, that sound is the first warning, a rising shriek that does not belong to any Japanese aircraft, a sound that reaches into the human hindbrain and triggers pure animal terror. The Japanese have trained for many scenarios. They have trained to fight American battleships, to intercept American bombers, to dogfight American fighters. They have not trained for this 36 dive bombers arriving simultaneously from directly overhead, splitting into sections that target individual carriers with surgical precision. When each pilot adjusting his dive angle in real time, correcting for wind and the target's radical maneuvering, releasing ordnance at the exact millisecond when probability collapses into certainty. Akagi turns hard to port. Her captain, standing on the bridge, screams orders. Her helmsman wrenches the wheel. 37,000 tons of steel and wood begins to heel over, her wake bending into a curve. But the laws of physics are unforgiving. A carrier does not turn like a destroyer. At 24 knots, Akagi's turning radius is measured in thousands of feet and tens of seconds. The men in the dive bombers above are calculating that turn, leading the target, adjusting the angle of their dive so that their bombs will arrive not where the carrier is, but where she will be. It is the same principle used by duck hunters. Yes, by anti-aircraft gunners, by anyone who has ever tried to hit a moving target. But this is the first time in history it is being executed with this level of coordination, from this altitude, at this scale, against the most powerful carrier fleet ever assembled. The first bomb, a 1,000-pound general-purpose weapon with a delayed fuse, strikes Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck near the center elevator. It passes through the hangar deck and detonates inside, amid the stacked torpedoes and bombs being moved by the ordnance crews. The explosion is not large by naval standards. 1,000 pounds of explosive is a fraction of what a battleship shell carries. But it is not the size of the explosion that matters. It is the location. The blast ruptures aviation fuel lines, ignites gasoline vapors, and sets off secondary explosions among the ordnance stacked in the hangar. Within seconds, Akagi is burning from the inside out, her hangar deck transformed into a blast furnace, the heat so intense that steel beams begin to glow cherry red. 2 more bombs hit seconds later. One penetrates the flight deck aft, detonating among fully fueled aircraft waiting to launch. The other hits near the forward elevator, collapsing it and trapping dozens of men below. The men working in the hangar deck, those who survive the initial blasts, try to fight the fires, but there is no fighting this. The ventilation systems designed to clear engine exhaust during flight operations now feed oxygen to the flames, turning the carrier into a giant forge. Fuel oil ignites. Ammunition cooks off in chattering strings of explosions. Men trapped below decks scream for help that will not come. Kaga, steaming parallel to Akagi, suffers worse. 4 bombs hit in rapid succession, transforming her flight deck into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. Her forward gasoline storage tanks rupture, flooding the hangar with aviation fuel that ignites in a rolling fireball. Men are incinerated where they stand. Others, clothes aflame, leap into the sea. The captain remains on the bridge, trying to maintain control, issuing orders that no one can execute because the communication systems are shattered and half his crew is dead. Soryu takes 3 bombs in the span of 60 seconds. One hits directly on the forward elevator, blowing it 400 feet into the air in a cartwheel of flame and metal. Another penetrates near the island, killing most of her senior officers instantly. The third detonates in her hangar bay, setting off a chain reaction among armed and fueled aircraft. She begins to list almost immediately, flooding through ruptured seams, her damage control teams overwhelmed. The entire attack, from the first bomb release to the last, takes less than 6 minutes. The American dive bombers pull out of their dives at 1,500 feet, so low that some pilots can see the expressions on the faces of Japanese sailors, and then they are gone, roaring away at full throttle, leaving behind 3 aircraft carriers transformed into floating pyres. On the bridge of his flagship, Vice Admiral Nagumo stands in stunned silence. Around him, staff officers shout into telephones trying to assess the damage, trying to establish control. But there is no control to be had. 3 of his 4 carriers are burning uncontrollably. Hiryu, the only carrier to escape the initial attack, will launch a retaliatory strike that cripples the Yorktown. But she too will be found and destroyed by dive bombers later that afternoon. In the span of a single day, the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval striking force in the world, ceases to exist. The Japanese had built their carriers with one purpose: to deliver a knockout blow in a decisive battle. They had designed their aircraft for range and offensive power, not for defense. They had trained their pilots to strike first, hard, and without mercy. But they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed that the Americans, cautious and methodical, would fight the kind of war the Japanese expected. A war of attrition, of slow advances, of predictable tactics. They had not anticipated that American doctrine, dismissed as unimaginative, was built on a different kind of precision. The Japanese excelled at the audacious strike, the long-range attack, the surprise blow. The Americans excelled at something quieter and deadlier: the ability to put ordnance on target under the worst possible conditions, to turn complex mathematics into routine procedure to make the impossible seem ordinary. The SBD Dauntless was not an impressive aircraft to look at. It was slow, unarmed except for a pair of forward-firing machine guns, and carried a crew of only two, a pilot and a rear seat gunner. Japanese pilots, flying the Nimble Zero, often called it the flying coffin. But what the Dauntless lacked in speed and firepower, it made up for in precision. And its perforated dive flaps allowed it to maintain a stable 70-degree dive without exceeding terminal velocity, giving the pilot time to aim. Its bomb sight was crude by later standards, but effective in the hands of a trained aviator, and American pilots trained obsessively. They practiced dive bombing against moving targets towed by destroyers. They practiced in good weather and bad, in daylight and twilight, until the geometry of the dive became second nature, until they could estimate range and deflection by instinct. The Japanese had never invested in this kind of training. Their dive bomber, the Aichi D-3A Val, was a capable aircraft, but Japanese doctrine emphasized the torpedo as the primary anti-ship weapon. Dive bombers were considered secondary, useful for finishing off damaged ships or attacking land targets, but not the main arm of the carrier strike. This was not an irrational choice. Torpedoes, when they hit, did far more damage than bombs. But torpedoes required low, slow approaches that made the attacking aircraft hideously vulnerable. At Midway, every single American torpedo bomber that attacked was either shot down or crippled. But their sacrifice bought time and drew the Japanese defenses downward, opening the sky for the dive bombers. The symbolic object of Midway is not a weapon. It is time. The Japanese are racing against time throughout the battle. Time to rearm their aircraft. Time to launch their strike. Time to recover their combat air patrol. They are always a few minutes behind, always reacting instead of dictating. The Americans, by contrast, have time on their side. Their dive bombers approach high and unseen, taking the time to set up their attacks, to coordinate between squadrons, to ensure that all three carriers are hit simultaneously so that none can aid the others. Time is the invisible resource, the thing that separates victory from annihilation. In the hours after the attack, as Akagi burns and lists and her crew abandons ship, her captain requests permission to go down with his vessel. Admiral Nagumo, evacuated to a destroyer, refuses. The carrier will burn through the night, her hull glowing red in the darkness, and will finally be scuttled by Japanese torpedoes the next morning. Kaga sinks first, her hangar deck explosions breaking her keel. Soryu follows in the evening, her captain among the last to leave. Hiryu, struck by dive bombers from Enterprise, burns through the night and is scuttled at dawn on June 5th. Yan with them go the flower of Japanese naval aviation. Not just the ships, but the trained mechanics, the experienced ordnance handlers, the irreplaceable specialists who made the Kido Butai function. Japan will build new carriers, but she will never replace the institutional knowledge that burns and sinks in those four hulls. The American pilots who delivered the attack are mostly young men, many in their early 20s, some on their first combat mission. They do not fully understand the magnitude of what they have accomplished. They know they scored hits. They know the carriers were burning. But they do not know, cannot know, flying away at low altitude with fuel gauges nudging empty, that they have just executed the most decisive air attack in naval history, that they have turned the tide of the Pacific War in 6 minutes. Yet what the Japanese admirals never knew, what their doctrine never accounted for, was that the Americans had turned dive bombing into a science. They had built training programs around it, developed aircraft specifically for it, and created a culture where hitting a moving target from 10,000 feet was not considered extraordinary. It was considered standard. The Japanese excelled at the bold stroke, the daring raid, the overwhelming assault. The Americans excelled at consistency, at repeatability, at turning exceptional skill into routine competence. At Midway, routine competence was enough to sink a fleet. The transformation this battle forced upon the Japanese military was profound and ultimately fatal. Before Midway, Japanese planning assumed that superior spirit, superior training, and superior experience would overcome material disadvantages. After Midway, those assumptions became impossible to sustain. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was catastrophic, but it was not, by itself, unrecoverable. Japan still had more carriers, more aircraft, more trained pilots. But Midway shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, both in the eyes of the Americans and, more importantly, in the eyes of the Japanese themselves. The Kido Butai had been untouchable, a symbol of Japanese modernity and power. Its destruction in a single afternoon revealed that American industry, American training, and American doctrine were not just competitive, they were, in key areas, superior. After Midway, the character of the Pacific War changed. The Japanese shifted from offensive operations to defensive ones, from conquest to consolidation, and they would fight with suicidal bravery for 3 more years, but they would never again seize the initiative. The Americans, by contrast, grew more confident, more aggressive, more willing to take risks because they had learned that their systems worked. The SBD Dauntless would go on to sink more enemy shipping than any other Allied aircraft, not because it was fast or heavily armed, but because it could put bombs exactly where they needed to go, mission after mission, month after month, in every corner of the Pacific. There is a moment, preserved in the combat reports and personal accounts, that captures the shock of the Japanese survivors. A petty officer from Akagi, pulled from the water by a destroyer, describes watching the bombs fall. He says they seemed to come from nowhere, that there was no time to react, or that the explosions followed one another so rapidly they blurred into a single sustained roar. He says he had believed Japanese carriers were unsinkable, not because their armor was impenetrable, but because their speed and agility made them impossible to hit. That belief, shared across the fleet, died with the carriers. The Americans had proven that speed and agility meant nothing if the attacker could calculate the geometry of the engagement faster than the defender could maneuver. The dive bombers themselves became objects of near mythological status among American naval aviators. Pilots spoke of the Dauntless with an affection usually reserved for living things. They called her slow but deadly, a play on the SBD designation. They praised her stability, her ruggedness, her willingness to absorb punishment and keep flying. Much more than any other aircraft, the Dauntless embodied the American approach to war in the Pacific. Not the fastest, not the most glamorous, but reliable, precise, and lethal when employed correctly. She was the aircraft equivalent of American industrial strategy, mass-produced, technically proficient, and optimized for a specific role. The recurring symbol throughout this battle is the descending dive bomber itself, the screaming approach, the moment of release, the pullout just above the waves. For the Japanese, that sound became the sound of death, the end of their Pacific dominance. For the Americans, it became the sound of vindication, proof that their methods, their training, their entire approach to carrier warfare was not just valid, but decisive. The dive bomber was a weapon that required courage, skill, and mathematical precision in equal measure. It was not a weapon for the reckless or the careless. It was a weapon for professionals, and at Midway, the professionals demonstrated their craft. In the years after Midway, Japanese naval theorists and American analysts alike studied the battle obsessively, trying to extract lessons, to understand how such a complete reversal of fortune could occur so quickly. The Japanese focused on tactical errors, Nagumo's hesitation, the failure to launch search planes early enough, the vulnerability of carriers with armed aircraft on deck. These were real factors, but they missed the deeper truth. The Americans had developed a weapons system, the carrier-based dive bomber, that was fundamentally more effective than the Japanese had anticipated. Yet they had trained their pilots to a higher standard of bombing accuracy than the Japanese believed possible. And they had employed that system with a level of coordination and timing that turned individual aircraft into a massed, simultaneous strike. The Japanese had prepared for many things, but they had not prepared for that. The epilogue of Midway is not written in the waters northwest of the atoll, but in the years that follow, in the slow, grinding advance across the Pacific, in the names of islands that become synonyms for sacrifice: Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The dive bombers are there at every stage, attacking Japanese shipping, supporting amphibious landings, striking airfields and fortifications. They are there not because they are irreplaceable, but because they are reliable. Yet because the system that produced them, the training, the doctrine, the industrial base, is capable of producing them in the thousands. By 1943, the SBD Dauntless is being supplemented and eventually replaced by the larger, faster SB-2C Helldiver, a plane that is faster and carries a heavier bomb load but is also more difficult to fly and less forgiving of pilot error. Many pilots, given the choice, prefer the older Dauntless. They trust her. The Japanese never develop an effective counter to the massed dive bomber attack. They improve their anti-aircraft defenses. They disperse their carriers. They develop radar and early warning systems, but they never solve the fundamental problem. A dive bomber attacking from high altitude, especially in groups, is almost impossible to intercept before it releases its ordnance. By the time the attack is detected, it is already too late. The geometry favors the attacker. Japanese doctrine adapts, emphasizing survivability and damage control, but these are reactive measures, acknowledgments of a vulnerability that cannot be eliminated. What the Japanese admirals never knew, sitting in their war rooms in Tokyo or aboard their flagships, planning operations and reviewing intelligence, was that the Americans had quietly revolutionized naval warfare. They had taken an existing weapon, the dive bomber, and refined it to a level of effectiveness that rendered the previous rules of engagement obsolete. They had done this not through a single brilliant innovation, but through systematic improvement: better training, better tactics, better coordination, better aircraft. Each individual improvement was small, incremental. Yes, the kind of thing that might not even appear in official reports. But taken together, they represented a transformation as significant as the introduction of the aircraft carrier itself. There is a photograph taken from one of the American carriers later in the day on June 4th that shows a single SBD Dauntless returning from the strike, its tail perforated with shrapnel holes, its rear gunner slumped in his seat, wounded but alive. The pilot is coaxing the damaged aircraft back to the carrier, adjusting trim to compensate for a damaged stabilizer, nursing the engine, calculating fuel and distance, determined to bring his gunner home. The photograph is grainy, black and white, but it captures something essential about the battle and the war. The importance of the individual within the system. It's the skill and courage required to execute doctrine, the difference between theory and practice. Doctrine said that dive bombers could hit moving carriers. This pilot and 34 others like him that morning proved it. In the end, what Midway taught was a lesson about assumptions. The Japanese assumed that their opponents would be cautious, predictable, and inferior. The Americans assumed that training, discipline, and technical proficiency could overcome disadvantages in experience. Both sides had reasons for their assumptions, rooted in culture, history, and previous engagements. But only one set of assumptions proved correct under fire. The 4 carriers that burned and sank northwest of Midway took with them not just men and machines, but an entire way of thinking about naval warfare. Yet the Japanese had believed that carriers were offensive weapons, meant to strike hard and withdraw, avoiding sustained combat. The Americans proved that carriers, properly employed with well-trained air groups, could fight a sustained, methodical battle and win. The Japanese had believed that the knockout blow was the ultimate expression of naval power. The Americans demonstrated that precision, coordination, and repeatability were deadlier than any single audacious strike. June 4, 1942, is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War, and rightly so. But it is also a case study in the invisible work that precedes victory: the training flights over empty ocean, the drills repeated until they become reflexive, the incremental improvements in doctrine and technique that, when tested in combat, mean the difference between hitting and missing, between victory and defeat, between survival and annihilation. The Japanese admirals never knew, could not have known, that American dive bombers could hit moving carriers at speed with such devastating accuracy. By the time they learned, it was too late. The lesson was written in fire and steel, in the wreckage of 4 carriers settling into the depths, in the shocked faces of survivors who had believed themselves invincible. The sky over the Pacific that morning had cracked open, and through that crack fell not just bombs, but the end of an era. The age of the battleship was already over, though some still refused to believe it. The age of the aircraft carrier had arrived, but even that was being redefined in real time. What Midway proved was that the carrier was not just a mobile airfield, a means of projecting power across distance. It was a platform for precision strike, a weapon that could deliver overwhelming force with surgical accuracy, that could find an enemy fleet in the vastness of the ocean and destroy it in minutes. And the men who made that possible were not superheroes or aces, but trained professionals executing a mission they had practiced 100 times before. They were ordinary men doing extraordinary things because their training, their doctrine, and their equipment allowed them to. That, more than any single tactical decision or stroke of luck, is what won the Battle of Midway. That is what the Japanese admirals never knew.